20 years of building their empire from the ground up, and they fired me in a sterile conference room without even looking me in the eye. What they didn't know was that I owned the patent to the core system that ran their entire operation, and I was about to watch their world crumble in real time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The security badge beeped twice before flashing red. I stared at the small LED light, watching it mock me with its mechanical indifference. 20 years of swiping this same card. 20 years of arriving before dawn to troubleshoot systems that kept this company breathing, and now it wouldn't even recognize me. The irony wasn't lost on me. I pressed my palm against the cold glass door and waited. A receptionist I'd never seen before glanced up nervously. Fresh face, probably hired last week. No nameplate on her desk, no practice smile, just the uncomfortable shuffle of someone who'd been briefed about an awkward situation but given no script to handle it. She looked maybe 22, young enough to still believe that hard work and loyalty mattered in corporate America. Restructuring meeting, I said quietly. The words tasted bitter, like overbrewed coffee left too long on the burner. She nodded too quickly, her fingers hovering over a keyboard she wasn't actually typing on. Just going through the motions, pretending to be busy while avoiding eye contact. I took the elevator alone to the 4th floor. The same elevator I'd ridden thousands of times, usually with my arms full of technical manuals or prototype hardware. Today my hands were empty. Conference room D, the one tucked away at the end of the hall where difficult conversations happened behind soundproof glass. They called it the fishbowl among the engineering staff, a cruel joke about transparency that offered none. Margaret Sullivan was already seated when I arrived, her silver hair pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn for the past decade. Chief Technology Officer, my former mentor, the woman who'd once told me I had the sharpest engineering mind she'd ever encountered. Today, she couldn't meet my eyes. Beside her sat Bradley Chen from Human Resources, shuffling through a stack of papers like they contained state secrets instead of standardized termination documents. "Sarah, thank you for joining us," Margaret began, her voice carrying that practiced corporate tone that strips all humanity from difficult conversations. "As part of Nexus Corporation's Strategic Optimization Initiative, we've conducted a comprehensive review of our engineering infrastructure and determined that a realignment of technical resources will better position us for scalable growth moving forward." I almost laughed. Almost. I'd helped Margaret craft similar speeches years ago, when we had to let go of underperforming team members. Back then, we'd sit in her office afterward, both of us feeling sick about the corporate doublespeak we'd been forced to use. Now here she was, wielding those same sanitized phrases against me like they were weapons. The young man across from me finally looked up from his tablet. David Morrison, barely 30, hired 6 months ago from some Silicon Valley startup that had burned through $40 million in venture capital before imploding. He had that aggressive confidence that comes from believing disruption is always better than experience. His LinkedIn profile probably listed innovation catalyst and paradigm shifter among his accomplishments. "We appreciate your contributions to the legacy systems," he said, the word legacy dripping with disdain. "But as we move toward next-generation solutions, we need to ensure our technical architecture aligns with contemporary methodologies." Legacy systems. 20 years of my life reduced to outdated infrastructure that needed replacing. I wanted to tell him about the nights I'd spent in this building, debugging code that kept their servers from crashing, optimizing algorithms that saved them millions in processing costs. I wanted to explain how I'd built the neural network framework that powered their entire recommendation engine, how I designed the data compression protocols that made their mobile app responsive enough to compete with tech giants. Instead, I said nothing. Sometimes silence speaks louder than arguments. Margaret slid a manila folder across the polished conference table. Standard severance package, probably calculated to the penny by some algorithm in HR's database. 6 months' salary, extended health benefits, a non-disclosure agreement thick enough to choke on. All I had to do was sign away my right to discuss anything I'd learned or built during my 2 decades here. "This is generous, Sarah," Bradley said, speaking for the first time since I'd entered the room. "The company recognizes your years of service and wants to ensure a smooth transition. Smooth transition." As if 20 years of institutional knowledge could be transferred like files on a hard drive. As if the intricate understanding I'd developed of their systems, their quirks, their vulnerabilities, could be documented in some handover manual. I looked around the room, remembering the last time I'd been here, 3 years ago, presenting the final prototype of the adaptive processing system to the board of directors. They'd been so excited, talking about revolutionary breakthrough and competitive advantage. The system I'd spent 18 months designing, coding, and testing until it was perfect. The system that now processed 97% of their data transactions. The system I'd patented under my own name. They'd been so eager to implement it, so focused on the immediate benefits, that they'd never bothered to read the fine print. The patent application I'd filed 2 years before completion, back when I still believed this company valued innovation over politics. Back when I thought my contributions would be recognized and rewarded instead of realigned and optimized out of existence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I need some time to review this, I said, closing the folder without looking at its contents. Margaret's eyebrows lifted slightly. She'd probably expected me to sign immediately, grateful for whatever scraps they were throwing my way. Of course, Bradley said, checking his watch. Take the weekend. We'll need your response by Monday morning. I stood up slowly, deliberately, not from hesitation, but from the weight of what I knew was coming. They thought they were cutting loose dead weight, trimming fat from their engineering budget. They had no idea they were about to lobotomize their own operation. Walking out of that conference room felt like shedding an old skin. 20 years of being the reliable one, the problem solver, the person who made miracles happen behind the scenes while others took credit during board presentations. 20 years of arriving early and staying late, of canceled vacations and missed family dinners, all in service of a company that had just told me I was obsolete. The badge reader beeped red one final time as I approached the exit. I didn't try to swipe it again. Instead, I handed it to the nervous receptionist and walked out into the crisp October air. I'd seen this coming for months, maybe even years. The subtle shifts in meeting invitations, my name gradually disappearing from email chains, the way conversations would pause when I entered the break room. It's amazing how predictable corporate betrayal becomes once you recognize the pattern. First they stop asking for your input, then they stop including you in decisions, then they start talking about your work in the past tense while you're still sitting in the room. The writing had been on the wall since the new VP of Engineering arrived 18 months ago. Thomas Brennan, another Silicon Valley refugee with an MBA from Stanford, and absolutely no understanding of the systems that actually kept this company running. He'd spent his first 6 months conducting, quote, efficiency audits and workflow optimizations, corporate speak for figuring out which veteran employees he could replace with cheaper alternatives. I'd watched him systematically dismantle teams that had worked together for years, breaking up partnerships that had been built on trust and shared expertise. He called it, quote, cross-functional integration. But what he really meant was that he wanted people who wouldn't question his authority or point out the flaws in his half-baked strategies. 3 months ago, he'd started holding weekly innovation sessions, where he'd brainstorm with David and the other young hires about revolutionary approaches to problems I'd already solved years earlier. I'd been invited to exactly one of these sessions, where I'd made the mistake of pointing out that their proposed solution would create bottlenecks in the data pipeline. Thomas had smiled condescendingly and thanked me for my traditional perspective. That's when I knew I was finished. But here's the thing about being an engineer for 20 years. You learn to plan for failure modes. You design redundancies, backup systems, contingency plans. And sometimes, if you're smart, you protect your most important work from the people who might try to steal it or destroy it. The adaptive processing system wasn't just any piece of software. It was the heart of Nexus Corporation's entire operation. The engine that powered everything from customer data analysis to inventory management to financial reporting. Without it, they'd be back to the clunky, inefficient systems they'd been using a decade ago. Systems that couldn't handle their current data volume, couldn't scale with their growth, couldn't compete with their rivals. And I owned it? Not Nexus Corporation. Not Thomas Brennan. Not the board of directors. Me. Patent number 11,247,839, filed under my name, assigned to my personal holding company. Every line of code, every algorithm, every optimization that made their business possible belonged to Sarah Michelle Rodriguez, unemployed software engineer. They'd never bothered to check the patent records. Why would they? I was just a loyal employee, grateful for my steady paycheck and modest office in the basement of the engineering building. They assumed that anything I created on company time automatically belonged to them, that my signature on an employment contract 20 years ago had signed away all my intellectual property rights forever. But I'd been careful, very careful. The core innovation, the breakthrough that made the system possible, had come to me during a weekend hiking trip in the mountains. I'd been thinking about data compression problems, trying to find a more elegant solution than the brute force approaches everyone else was using. The insight had hit me while I was sitting by a stream, watching water flow around rocks and find the most efficient path downstream. I'd spent the next 6 months developing the concept on my own time, using my personal equipment, in my home office. Only after I'd filed the patent application did I propose the project to Nexus Corporation. And even then, I'd been smart about it. The implementation I'd built for them was customized, optimized for their specific needs, but the underlying patent covered the fundamental approach that made it all possible. They thought they were licensing my services. What they'd actually done was lease the most critical piece of their infrastructure from someone they'd just fired. The drive home gave me time to think, to plan, to feel the strange mixture of betrayal and anticipation that comes with knowing a secret that could destroy your enemies. 20 years of loyalty, of putting the company's needs before my own, of believing that hard work and expertise would be rewarded. 20 years of being taken for granted, overlooked for promotions that went to less qualified candidates, watching my innovations get credited to managers who couldn't code their way out of a paper bag. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a long moment, engine cooling in the silence. My house looked the same as always. Modest suburban comfort, bought with careful savings and delayed gratification. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer Sarah Rodriguez, senior systems engineer at Nexus Corporation. I was Sarah Rodriguez, patent holder and soon-to-be very wealthy woman. My phone buzzed with a text message from Jenny, my former teammate and closest friend at the company. Heard what happened. This is insane. Call me when you can. I smiled and put the phone away. There would be time for explanations later, time to help Jenny and the others understand what was really happening. Right now, I had work to do. Legal work, financial work. The kind of preparation that would ensure Nexus Corporation learned the most expensive lesson in corporate history. They thought they'd fired a replaceable employee. What they'd actually done was trigger a clause in a licensing agreement they didn't know existed, for a patent they didn't know I owned, covering technology they couldn't operate without. Monday morning was going to be very interesting. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything feel possible. I'd spent the weekend in my home office, surrounded by legal documents, patent filings, and licensing agreements that most people would find mind-numbingly boring. To me, they read like poetry. Beautiful, devastating poetry that was about to rewrite the power dynamics at Nexus Corporation forever. The first call came at 7:30 a.m., just as I was finishing my second cup of coffee. Unknown number, but I recognized the area code. Corporate headquarters. Sarah, it's Margaret. We need to talk. Her voice carried a tension I'd never heard before, the kind that comes from discovering you've made a catastrophic mistake. Can you come in this morning? I'm no longer an employee, Margaret. If Nexus Corporation wants to discuss business with me, they'll need to go through my attorney. I gave her the number for Patricia Williams, the intellectual property lawyer I'd retained over the weekend. Patent law specialist, Harvard-educated, with a reputation for crushing corporations that tried to steal innovations from independent inventors. Sarah, please. There seems to be some confusion about the adaptive processing system. We're having some technical difficulties and... No confusion on my end, I interrupted. The system is working exactly as designed. The question is whether Nexus Corporation has the legal right to use it. Silence. Long, expensive silence while Margaret processed what I'd just told her. "We'll be in touch," she said finally, and hung up. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. The technical difficulties she'd mentioned weren't actually difficulties at all. They were features. Specifically, they were automated license verification protocols I'd built into the system's core architecture. Every time the system processed data, it checked for valid licensing credentials. And as of Friday evening, when my termination became official, those credentials had expired. The system wasn't broken, it was just refusing to work for free. My phone rang again 20 minutes later. This time it was Thomas Brennan, the VP of Engineering who'd orchestrated my firing. His voice had lost all its condescending smoothness. "Rodriguez, what the hell did you do to our systems?" "Good morning, Thomas. I didn't do anything to your systems. I simply stopped providing free access to mine." "Your systems? You built that software on company time, using company resources. It belongs to Nexus Corporation." "Actually, it doesn't. Patent number 11,247,839 says otherwise. The core technology belongs to me, and Nexus Corporation never negotiated a licensing agreement. You've been using my intellectual property without permission for 3 years." I could hear him typing furiously in the background, probably pulling up the patent database for the first time in his career. The silence stretched longer this time, punctuated by what sounded like him choking on his morning coffee. "This is impossible. Our legal department would have caught this. Your legal department reviews employee contracts and vendor agreements. They don't typically audit patent ownership for internally developed projects, especially when the inventor is already on payroll." I paused, letting that sink in. "It's a common oversight, actually. Companies assume that paying an engineer's salary automatically grants them ownership of every idea that engineer has. But patent law is much more specific than employment law." "What do you want?" His voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I want what any patent holder wants when their intellectual property is being used without authorization. Fair compensation for the value I've provided." That's when I heard him slam something down on his desk. Probably his coffee mug or maybe his fist. "How much?" "We can discuss terms once your legal team has had time to review the situation properly. I'd suggest starting with a retroactive licensing fee for the past 3 years of unauthorized usage, plus ongoing royalties for future use. My attorney will be sending over a formal notice this afternoon." I hung up before he could respond. There's something profoundly satisfying about ending a conversation on your own terms, especially with someone who'd spent months treating you like an obsolete piece of equipment. The next few hours were a masterclass in corporate panic. My phone rang constantly. Margaret again, Bradley from HR, even the chief financial officer, a man I'd spoken to maybe twice in 20 years. Each conversation followed the same pattern: disbelief, anger, desperate attempts at negotiation, and finally grudging acceptance that they were in serious trouble. By noon, I'd received 3 voice messages from the CEO himself, Richard Hawthorne, the same man who'd walked past me in the hallway for 2 decades without acknowledging my existence, was now personally calling to discuss mutually beneficial solutions to our current technical challenge. I didn't call him back. Instead, I drove to Patricia Williams's office downtown, a gleaming tower of glass and steel that housed some of the most powerful legal minds in the country. She was everything you'd want in an intellectual property attorney: brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely fascinated by cases that involved David and Goliath dynamics. "This is beautiful work, Sarah," she said, reviewing the patent documentation spread across her mahogany conference table. "Clean filing, comprehensive coverage, and absolutely bulletproof. They don't have a legal leg to stand on. What kind of settlement are we looking at?" Patricia smiled, the kind of smile that had probably made opposing counsel wet themselves in courtrooms across the country. "Conservative estimate? $50 million for retroactive licensing, plus ongoing royalties that should net you about $10 million annually. But that's if they want to settle quickly and quietly. And if they don't? If they want to fight this in court, we're looking at treble damages for willful patent infringement. That could push the settlement north of $200 million, not counting legal fees and punitive damages." She leaned back in her leather chair. Of course, there's also the possibility that their entire operation collapses while we're litigating. Hard to negotiate a settlement with a company that's in bankruptcy. That afternoon, Patricia hand-delivered our initial demand letter to Nexus Corporation's headquarters. 24 hours to respond to our licensing terms, or we'd be filing a federal lawsuit for patent infringement. The clock was ticking, and every hour they delayed was costing them millions in lost productivity. I spent the evening reading industry publications online, watching the ripple effects spread through Nexus Corporation's business ecosystem. Their stock price had dropped 8% since market open, with financial analysts speculating about, quote, technical difficulties and operational disruptions. Customer support forums were filling up with complaints about slow response times and system errors. The beautiful thing about the adaptive processing system was how deeply integrated it had become with every aspect of their operation. It wasn't just software they could replace overnight. It was the nervous system that connected their entire corporate body. Without it, they were experiencing the business equivalent of a stroke. Tuesday morning brought a new development, a conference call with Nexus Corporation's entire executive team. Not a summons this time, but a formal request transmitted through Patricia's office. They wanted to negotiate. I drove to Patricia's office again, settling into the same conference room where we'd planned our strategy the day before. The speakerphone crackled to life at exactly 9 a.m., carrying the voices of people who'd spent the last 48 hours discovering how much their company depended on my work. Sarah, thank you for agreeing to this call. Richard Hawthorne's voice carried the careful tone of a man who'd been thoroughly briefed by his legal team. We'd like to discuss terms for licensing your technology. I'm listening. We're prepared to offer a one-time payment of $5 million for perpetual licensing rights to the adaptive processing system. I looked at Patricia, who was already shaking her head and making notes on her legal pad. Mr. Hawthorne, that offer doesn't even cover the legal costs they've incurred by using my technology without authorization. We'll need to see something more realistic. What would you consider realistic? This from Margaret, her voice strained with exhaustion. Patricia leaned toward the speaker. This is Patricia Williams, representing Ms. Rodriguez. Our initial analysis suggests a fair licensing agreement would include $35 million in retroactive fees, plus a 20% royalty on all revenue generated by systems that utilize the patented technology. The silence on the other end was so complete, I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Thomas Brennan spoke up. 20% of our revenue? That's insane. The technology is just one component of our overall system. Actually, Mr. Brennan, it's the component that makes your overall system possible, I said. Without the adaptive processing system, Nexus Corporation would be running on infrastructure that couldn't handle 10% of your current data volume. Your mobile app would crash under normal usage. Your customer analytics would take hours instead of minutes. Your entire competitive advantage disappears. We could rebuild the system, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You could try, Patricia replied. But Ms. Rodriguez's patent covers the fundamental algorithmic approach that makes high-speed adaptive processing possible. Any system you built would either infringe on her patent or be substantially inferior to what you're currently using. Either way, you'd be looking at years of development time and hundreds of millions in lost revenue. The call continued for another hour, with various executives proposing alternative terms and Patricia systematically explaining why each offer was inadequate. Finally, Richard Hawthorne asked for 48 hours to discuss the matter with his board of directors. Of course, Patricia said, but I should mention that every day of unauthorized usage adds to the damages calculation. And if this matter proceeds to litigation, we'll be seeking treble damages plus attorney fees. Wednesday and Thursday passed quietly. I spent the time working in my garden, reading books I'd been meaning to get to for years, and trying to process the surreal nature of my situation. 6 months ago, I'd been worried about my job security and retirement savings. Now I was potentially looking at generational wealth, all because I'd been smart enough to protect my most important work. Jenny called Thursday evening, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. Sarah, the whole engineering department is going crazy. Half the senior staff is threatening to quit if they don't resolve this soon. The junior developers can't maintain the system without documentation, and Thomas won't admit that all the documentation was in your head. What about David Morrison? Isn't he supposed to be the next generation solution? Jenny laughed, but it sounded bitter. David hasn't been able to figure out how the system works, let alone fix any of the optimization issues that keep cropping up. Yesterday, he spent 6 hours trying to debug a memory leak that you could have solved in 15 minutes. And management? Richard Hawthorne held an all-hands meeting this morning. Lots of corporates speak about temporary challenges and innovative solutions, but you could see the panic in his eyes. The word around the office is that 3 major clients are threatening to switch to competitors if the performance issues aren't resolved soon. Friday morning arrived with a call from Patricia. They're ready to settle. Conference call at 2 p.m. This time, the tone was completely different. Richard Hawthorne sounded like a man who'd spent sleepless nights staring at financial projections and realizing his company was bleeding money with every passing hour. Sarah, we've reviewed your licensing terms, and we're prepared to accept them. All of them? Patricia asked. $35 million in retroactive licensing fees, paid immediately. 20% royalty on all revenue from systems utilizing the patented technology, calculated quarterly. And... He paused, as if the words were physically painful to speak. We'd like to offer you a consulting contract to help with system optimization and future development. I'd been expecting the settlement, but the consulting offer caught me off guard. What kind of consulting contract? Margaret's voice joined the call. $200,000 annually, plus equity compensation. Flexible schedule, work-from-home options. Essentially, we want to ensure that you're available when we need technical guidance. It was Thomas Brennan's turn to speak, and I could hear the defeat in his voice. We've realized that the adaptive processing system is more complex than we initially understood. There are optimization routines and efficiency protocols that aren't documented anywhere. Without your expertise, we're basically running a Formula One race car without understanding how the engine works. Patricia and I exchanged glances. This was beyond what we'd hoped for. Not only were they paying for past usage and future licensing, they were essentially begging me to help them understand the technology they'd been taking for granted. I'll consider the consulting arrangement, I said. But there will be additional terms. I want final approval authority over any modifications to the core system. I want direct access to the engineering team without management interference. And I want public credit for my work. No more hiding behind corporate authorship. Agreed, Richard said immediately. One more thing, I added, surprising myself with the request. I want Thomas Brennan removed from any oversight of the engineering department. He's proven that he doesn't understand the technology or the people who build it. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Richard's voice came back over the speaker. Thomas will be transitioning to a new role in business development. And just like that, it was over. 20 years of being undervalued, overlooked, and ultimately betrayed, resolved in a single phone call that made me wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, and gave me more power over my former employer than I'd ever imagined possible. The settlement documents were signed the following Monday. $35 million appeared in my bank account like magic, followed by the first quarterly royalty payment of $3 million. I was officially rich, officially vindicated, and officially back in control of the technology that had defined my career. But the money, as satisfying as it was, wasn't really the point. The point was proving that loyalty and expertise have value, that corporations can't simply discard people like worn-out equipment, that sometimes the quiet engineer in the basement holds all the cards. I started my consulting work the following week, walking back into the Nexus Corporation building with a visitor's badge and a contract that gave me more authority than most of the executives. The nervous receptionist from my termination meeting looked confused when I signed in, probably wondering why the woman who'd been fired was suddenly being escorted to the executive floor. My first meeting was with the engineering team, the same brilliant people I'd worked with for years, who were now struggling to maintain systems they didn't fully understand. The relief in their faces was almost heartbreaking. They'd been drowning without the institutional knowledge that had walked out the door with me. "Welcome back, Sarah," Jenny said, and I could see tears in her eyes. "I'm not really back," I replied. "I'm just here to help you understand what you've been working with all along." Over the next few months, I watched Nexus Corporation transform from a company in crisis to one that was more efficient and profitable than ever before. The adaptive processing system, properly maintained and optimized, began delivering performance improvements that impressed even me. Stock prices recovered and soared. Customer satisfaction reached all-time highs. And every quarter, when the royalty payments arrived in my account, I was reminded that sometimes the best revenge isn't just success. It's making your former oppressors pay for the privilege of benefiting from the talent they tried to throw away. I kept the consulting contract for 2 years before deciding I'd taught them enough to maintain the systems without constant guidance. By then, I had more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, and the satisfaction of knowing that my innovations were being properly recognized and credited. These days, I spend my time however I choose. Some days I work on new patents, exploring ideas that might revolutionize other industries. Some days I mentor young engineers, helping them understand not just the technical aspects of innovation, but the business and legal frameworks that protect their work. And sometimes, when I'm feeling nostalgic, I drive past the Nexus Corporation building and smile at the thought that somewhere inside, in servers humming quietly in climate-controlled rooms, my code is still running, still processing millions of transactions, still generating revenue that flows partially back to me. They thought they could fire me and erase my contributions. Instead, they learned the most expensive lesson in corporate history, that true innovation can't be owned by companies, only licensed from the brilliant minds that create it. The quiet engineer in the basement had the last laugh after all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.